The server room on the third floor of Teknova Industries hummed with the constant white noise of cooling fans and data processing that kept our financial software company running 24 hours a day. Red and green lights blinked in endless patterns across rows of black server cabinets, each one processing thousands of transactions for clients who trusted us with their most sensitive financial data. I stood among these machines like a digital shepherd, monitoring system health and performance metrics that most people in the company never thought about, but which determined whether we remained profitable or faced catastrophic failure. My badge read Senior Systems Administrator, but after 12 years at Teknova, I was really the keeper of institutional knowledge, the person who understood not just how our systems worked, but why they had been designed that way, what their vulnerabilities were, and how to prevent the kind of failures that could destroy client relationships built over decades. Davidson! The voice belonged to Brad Hutchinson, CEO Charles Hutchinson's nephew, who had been installed as Chief Technology Officer 6 months earlier, despite having exactly 18 months of actual technology experience. His uncle's decision to bypass the traditional promotion pathway and place Brad directly into senior leadership had created tension throughout the engineering department, but family connections trumped merit in the Hutchinson business philosophy. "Server maintenance is scheduled for this weekend," I replied, without looking up from the monitoring console where I was reviewing performance logs from the past week. "All client notifications have been sent, backup systems are prepared, and the maintenance window has been coordinated with customer service to minimize any impact." Brad approached with the swagger he had developed since assuming his elevated position. His expensive suit and confident posture meant to project authority that his technical knowledge couldn't support. Change of plans. "We're implementing the new load balancing system tonight instead of following your conservative maintenance schedule." The statement hit me like cold water. The load balancing upgrade was a complex modification that required careful testing and gradual implementation across multiple server clusters. Attempting it during peak business hours with active client systems running represented exactly the kind of reckless decision-making that could result in catastrophic system failure. "Brad, that upgrade requires at least 12 hours of downtime and extensive testing before production deployment," I said, turning to face him directly. "Implementing it tonight would put every client system at risk during tomorrow's peak trading hours." His smirk was practiced, the expression of someone who had never faced serious consequences for poor judgment. "That's why I'm in charge now, Davidson. I make the strategic decisions while you handle the technical implementation. The board wants to see innovation and aggressive improvement, not the same cautious approach that's kept us stagnant for years." The dismissal of prudent system management as stagnation revealed how little Brad understood about the infrastructure that supported Teknova's reputation and client relationships. "Brad, this isn't about being conservative versus innovative," I pressed, pulling up the technical specifications for the load balancing system on my workstation. "This upgrade requires complete reconfiguration of our primary database connections. If something goes wrong during implementation, we could lose transaction data for every client currently processing end-of-month financial reports." The timing couldn't have been worse. The final Thursday of the month when our client base of accounting firms, investment managers, and corporate finance departments ran their most critical operations. A system failure during this period wouldn't just inconvenience users. It could cost clients millions in missed deadlines and regulatory compliance failures. Brad waved dismissively at the technical documentation I was trying to show him. "Your problem, Davidson, is that you think like a maintenance guy instead of a leader. The new system will improve performance by 30% once it's properly implemented. Our clients will thank us for the upgrade." "If it's properly implemented," I emphasized, "which requires the testing protocols I've designed specifically to prevent the kind of catastrophic failures that have destroyed other companies attempting similar upgrades." The testing protocols represented months of preparation, systematic verification procedures that would ensure compatibility with existing client configurations, load testing that simulated peak usage conditions, and rollback procedures that could restore service if unexpected problems emerged. These safeguards were based on industry best practices and lessons learned from notorious system failures at competitor companies. "Testing is for companies that can't afford downtime," Brad replied with the confidence of someone who had never been personally responsible for system failures. "Teknova is moving beyond that limited thinking. We're implementing the upgrade tonight, and I expect your full cooperation in making it successful. The cooperation he demanded essentially meant that I would be responsible for the technical implementation while he claimed credit for the strategic innovation, a pattern that had characterized most of his initiatives since assuming the CTO position. When his decisions succeeded, Brad presented them as evidence of his visionary leadership. When they failed, responsibility somehow migrated to the technical staff, who had failed to implement his vision correctly. "I need this decision in writing," I said, moving to my computer to draft an email that would document both his directive and my professional objections, along with explicit acknowledgement that you're overriding the established maintenance protocols, despite warnings about potential system failures. Brad's expression darkened at this attempt to create accountability for what he clearly viewed as unquestionable executive authority. "Are you questioning my decision-making authority, Davidson? Because that kind of insubordination isn't tolerated at my level of the organization." The implied threat was clear: comply with his directive without creating documentation of my objections, or face disciplinary action for challenging his executive prerogatives. It was the same intimidation tactic his uncle employed throughout Technova, using hierarchy to suppress dissent rather than addressing the substance of concerns being raised. "I'm documenting my professional assessment of the risks involved," I clarified, continuing to type while speaking. "If you want to proceed despite those risks, that's your authority as CTO. But I won't be held responsible for failures that result from inadequate preparation." Brad snatched the wireless mouse from my desk, interrupting my documentation. "There won't be any failures because you're going to ensure the implementation goes perfectly. That's what you're paid to do. Make my decisions successful, not second-guess them with paranoid scenarios." His physical intervention, literally preventing me from creating records of our conversation, crossed a line from professional pressure to workplace intimidation. The action also revealed how seriously concerned he was about having his decision-making process documented, despite his expressed confidence in the upgrade's success. "I'll begin the implementation at midnight," I said, recognizing that further argument would only escalate the confrontation without changing the outcome. "But I'm requiring all affected clients to be notified of potential service interruptions during the upgrade window." "Absolutely not," Brad replied immediately. "Client notifications would suggest uncertainty about our capabilities. The upgrade will be transparent to end users. That's the whole point of proper technical execution. This prohibition against warning clients about potential service disruptions completed the picture of reckless decision-making that prioritized appearance over substance, executive ego over operational prudence. Brad was demanding that I implement a high-risk upgrade without the safety measures necessary to protect client data, while simultaneously preventing me from alerting those clients to prepare for possible service interruptions. "Brad," I said, making one final attempt to inject rationality into what had become an exercise in corporate power dynamics. "If this upgrade fails during peak operating hours tomorrow, Technova could lose clients representing millions in annual revenue. The board expects you to protect company assets, not risk them for marginal performance improvements." His laugh was dismissive, tinged with the arrogance of someone who had never personally experienced the consequences of technological failure. "The board expects results, Davidson. They promoted me because I deliver innovation while you and the other old-timers worry about hypothetical problems that never actually occur." As he strode from the server room with his characteristic swagger, leaving me alone with the blinking lights and humming processors that would soon be subjected to his reckless experimentation, I realized I was facing the most challenging night of my technical career. The system upgrade he was demanding could indeed work perfectly, or it could destroy Technova's reputation and client relationships through the kind of catastrophic failure that had been the subject of industry warnings and technical best practices for years. Either way, I would be the person held responsible for the outcome, while Brad positioned himself to claim credit for success or assign blame for failure according to whatever narrative best served his career advancement within the Hutchinson family power structure. Midnight approached with ominous precision as I completed final preparations for the load balancing upgrade that would either demonstrate Brad's technical vision or expose his dangerous incompetence. The server room felt like mission control for a space launch. Multiple monitoring stations displaying system health, backup power supplies humming at ready status, direct communication lines open to our emergency response team. Despite Brad's prohibition, I had quietly alerted our most critical clients through informal channels, suggesting they might want to delay major processing runs until Friday afternoon due to scheduled maintenance activities. Several client IT administrators had responded with appreciation for the heads-up, though none questioned why official notifications hadn't been sent through standard channels. "Status report," Brad demanded as he entered the server room at 11:45 p.m., his usual business attire replaced by casual clothes that somehow made his authoritative posturing seem more absurd. He had apparently decided that overseeing the upgrade personally would demonstrate his hands-on leadership style, despite lacking the technical expertise to understand what he was observing. "Primary systems are stable, backup procedures are in place, and the upgrade packages have been tested on our development environment," I reported, though the development tests had revealed several compatibility issues that would require manual intervention during production implementation. "However, I'm still strongly recommending we postpone until the weekend maintenance window." "Negative," Brad replied with military precision that seemed laughably inappropriate for someone whose technological experience was measured in months rather than years. "We proceed on schedule. The board meeting is Monday morning, and I want to present the performance improvements as evidence of my strategic leadership." This revelation of his true motivation, positioning the upgrade as a personal achievement for board presentation, confirmed what I had suspected about the rushed timeline. Brad wasn't driven by technical necessity or client benefit, but by his desire to demonstrate measurable accomplishments that would justify his uncle's controversial appointment decision. As midnight arrived and I began the implementation sequence, the first warning signs appeared almost immediately. The load balancing software was generating error messages indicating compatibility problems with our financial transaction processing modules. Exactly the kind of issues I had predicted would require extensive testing to resolve safely. "Minor glitches," Brad declared when I showed him the error logs accumulating on my monitoring screen. "Keep going. These systems are designed to handle temporary instabilities during upgrade processes." His dismissal of clear warning indicators revealed the dangerous combination of ignorance and overconfidence that had characterized his entire tenure as CTO. Rather than acknowledging potential problems and taking corrective action, he was interpreting system distress signals as normal operational variations. 30 minutes into the upgrade, the error messages had escalated to critical alerts, with several client connections timing out and transaction processing speeds declining significantly. The monitoring displays showed system performance degrading in exactly the patterns our development testing had suggested would occur if compatibility issues weren't resolved before production deployment. "We need to abort and roll back immediately," I announced, my hands already moving toward the emergency procedures that could restore service before the damage became irreversible. "The system integration is failing in ways that will cascade to complete service outage if we don't act now." "Absolutely not," Brad commanded, physically positioning himself between me and the rollback controls. "You're panicking over normal upgrade fluctuations. I'm ordering you to complete the implementation according to the planned timeline." His interference with emergency procedures crossed the line from poor judgment to potential sabotage of critical client services. The load balancing system was failing progressively, with performance metrics dropping toward levels that would trigger automatic disconnection of client systems designed to protect their data from corrupted transactions. "Brad, look at the monitoring displays," I insisted, pointing toward screens that showed cascading system failures spreading across our entire network infrastructure. "This isn't fluctuation, it's systematic breakdown of core services. I see temporary performance variations that will stabilize once the implementation completes," he replied, his tone suggesting either deliberate denial or genuine inability to interpret the technical data that clearly indicated impending catastrophic failure. At 1:15 a.m., exactly 75 minutes after the upgrade began, the primary transaction server crashed completely, taking with it the financial processing capabilities that served over 300 client companies. Red warning lights illuminated the server room like a Christmas tree of technological disaster, while alarm notifications began flooding my monitoring systems with messages indicating total service outage across all client connections. Brad stared at the displays with dawning horror, his confident predictions of seamless upgrade success replaced by the undeniable reality of complete system failure during peak client operating hours. The minor glitches he had dismissed as normal fluctuations had escalated exactly as I had predicted into the kind of catastrophic outage that could destroy Technova's reputation and client relationships overnight. "Fix it," he whispered, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Fix it now." But the damage was done. Client data was locked in corrupted transaction logs. Backup systems had been overwhelmed by the cascade failure, and restoration would require hours of careful work to prevent permanent data loss. The upgrade that was supposed to demonstrate Brad's innovative leadership had instead created the worst service outage in Technova's 20-year history. The next 8 hours passed in a blur of emergency procedures, frantic client communications, and increasingly desperate attempts to restore service while minimizing data loss. By 9 a.m., when Technova's staff began arriving for what they assumed would be a normal business day, our offices had been transformed into a crisis command center with engineers working frantically to rebuild systems that Brad's reckless upgrade had destroyed. CEO Charles Hutchinson arrived at 7 a.m., his expression darkening as he absorbed the scope of the disaster that had unfolded under his nephew's leadership. The client complaint calls had begun at 6 a.m. when East Coast companies discovered they couldn't access critical financial data needed for morning operations, and the volume was increasing exponentially as West Coast clients encountered similar problems. "How bad is this?" Charles demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury as he surveyed the emergency operations that had replaced normal business activities. "Complete service outage, affecting all client systems," I reported, consulting the damage assessment I had been compiling throughout the night. "Estimated restoration time is 12 to 18 hours if we can avoid additional complications during the recovery process." The timeline was optimistic but realistic, provided we could execute the rollback procedures without encountering the secondary failures that often accompanied emergency system restorations. The corrupted data would require manual verification and reconstruction, a process that couldn't be rushed without risking permanent loss of client information. "Brad assured me this upgrade was routine maintenance with minimal risk," Charles said, his gaze shifting to his nephew, who stood beside the monitoring stations looking like he was facing execution rather than performance review. "He specifically said client impact would be negligible." Brad's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by desperate attempts to shift responsibility away from his decision-making to technical implementation challenges he claimed hadn't been adequately communicated to him. "Davidson didn't mention these compatibility issues during our planning discussions," he insisted, gesturing weakly toward the displays showing system failures he had ignored despite explicit warnings. "I documented every risk factor in writing," I replied, producing the email chain where I had outlined specific concerns about compatibility testing, timeline pressures, and the need for comprehensive backup procedures. These failures were predictable and preventable through proper preparation. Charles reviewed my documentation with growing anger, his expression reflecting recognition that his nephew had not only made catastrophic technical decisions, but had done so despite receiving clear warnings from the person most qualified to assess the risks involved. "Why wasn't the upgrade postponed when these concerns were raised?" Charles asked, his question directed at Brad, but answered by his nephew's inability to provide any explanation beyond personal desire to present achievements at Monday's board meeting. The phone began ringing with increasing frequency as news of Technova's outage spread through financial industry networks. Competitors were already reaching out to our clients, offering emergency data processing services, while suggesting that Technova's technical problems might be systemic rather than temporary. Each call represented potential permanent client loss, relationships that had taken years to build being destroyed by a single night of reckless technical decision-making. "Sir," interrupted Maria Santos, our customer service director, her voice strained from hours of managing increasingly hostile client communications. "Meridian Financial is threatening to terminate their contract immediately unless we can guarantee this won't happen again. They're saying this outage has cost them over $2 million in delayed transactions." Meridian Financial represented Technova's largest client, a relationship that generated nearly 15% of our annual revenue. Losing them would trigger a financial crisis that could force company-wide layoffs and potentially threaten Technova's survival as an independent entity. "What would it take to guarantee system stability going forward?" Charles asked me directly. bypassing Brad entirely in a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone present in the server room. Immediate implementation of the comprehensive testing and maintenance protocols that were bypassed for this upgrade, I replied, along with clear authority to override any technical decisions that threaten system integrity, regardless of timeline pressures or executive preferences. The proposal essentially stripped Brad of meaningful authority over technical operations while positioning me as the final arbiter of decisions affecting system stability. A dramatic reversal of the hierarchy that had precipitated this crisis through Brad's reckless ambition and technical incompetence. Brad's face flushed red as the implications of my proposal registered. "You can't be serious, Uncle Charles. Davidson is trying to use this temporary setback to undermine my authority and advance his own position." "Temporary setback?" Charles's voice rose with barely controlled rage. "Brad, we've lost complete service for our entire client base during peak operating hours. This isn't a setback. It's a disaster that could destroy everything I've built over 20 years. The confrontation between uncle and nephew played out against the backdrop of continued system failures and escalating client complaints. Brad's protestations about his innovative vision and strategic thinking sounded increasingly hollow, as evidence mounted that his decision-making had created exactly the catastrophic scenarios that proper technical management was designed to prevent. "Davidson," Charles said, his tone shifting to the authoritative cadence he employed for critical business decisions. "What's your assessment of recovery timeline and long-term client retention prospects?" This direct appeal for my professional judgment, delivered in Brad's presence and clearly positioning my expertise as more valuable than his executive authority, marked a dramatic shift in Technova's internal power dynamics. The technical crisis had forced recognition of competence over connections, merit over family privilege. "Recovery will take at least 15 hours if we execute emergency procedures correctly," I replied, consulting the detailed restoration plan I had been refining throughout the crisis. "Client retention will depend on how transparently we communicate about both the cause of this failure and the measures we're implementing to prevent recurrence." By noon on Friday, the server restoration was proceeding according to my emergency protocols, though the damage to Technova's reputation was mounting with each hour of continued service interruption. Client complaints had escalated from frustrated phone calls to formal contract termination notices, with 3 major accounts already announcing they were switching to competitors whose systems had remained operational during our crisis. Charles Hutchinson paced the server room like a caged predator, his usual executive composure shattered by watching his life's work being destroyed by his nephew's combination of arrogance and incompetence. Brad had been relegated to a corner desk where he sat hunched over his laptop, presumably updating his resume while the extent of his catastrophic judgment became impossible to deny or minimize. "Meridian Financial's attorney just called," Maria Santos reported, her voice tight with stress from hours of managing increasingly hostile client communications. "They're claiming breach of service guarantees and demanding immediate compensation for losses caused by our outage. Legal suggests we could be facing lawsuits exceeding $10 million. The financial implications of Brad's reckless upgrade decision were expanding beyond simple client retention to encompass potential litigation that could threaten Technova's corporate survival. Financial software companies lived or died by their reliability. A single catastrophic failure could generate liability claims that exceeded years of profitable operations." "What's our insurance coverage for this type of incident?" Charles asked, his business instincts focusing on damage limitation, while technical recovery continued. "Professional liability covers up to $5 million per incident," replied Jennifer Walsh, our general counsel, who had been fielding legal threats since dawn. "But coverage is void if the incident resulted from willful negligence or deviation from industry standards." This caveat transformed the insurance question into a potential corporate survival issue. If Brad's decision to override established maintenance protocols was deemed willful negligence, Technova could face the full financial consequences of client losses without insurance protection. "Brad," Charles said, his voice carrying the flat tone that employees recognized as precursor to termination, "explain to me again why you felt it was appropriate to implement an untested system upgrade during peak client operating hours, despite explicit warnings from your senior technical staff." The question was phrased as invitation for explanation, but delivered with the prosecutorial intensity of someone gathering evidence for decisions already made. Brad's stammered response about innovation requirements and competitive pressure only strengthened the case against his judgment and competence. The upgrade was thoroughly tested, Brad insisted weakly, contradicting documentation that showed development testing had been incomplete and had actually identified the compatibility problems now crippling our production systems. The failures were caused by implementation errors, not planning deficiencies. This attempt to shift blame to my technical execution was both factually inaccurate and strategically desperate. Brad was accusing me of sabotaging an upgrade he had ordered me to implement against my professional judgment, a narrative that would be impossible to sustain given the documented evidence of my warnings and objections. "Sarah," Charles said, turning toward me with an expression that combined respect, urgency, and calculation, "I need your honest assessment. Can Technova recover from this crisis with its current technical leadership structure intact?" The question was really asking whether Brad could remain in his position while the company attempted to rebuild client confidence and financial stability. My answer would influence not just corporate reorganization but the family dynamics that had placed an unqualified relative in a critical technical role. Recovery requires leadership that prioritizes system stability over personal achievement, I replied carefully, and decision-making based on technical reality rather than wishful thinking about what clients and markets will tolerate. The diplomatic phrasing avoided direct accusation while making clear that Brad's continued authority represented an ongoing threat to Technova's survival prospects. Charles nodded, his expression confirming that my assessment aligned with conclusions he had been reaching through his own observation of the crisis. "Brad," Charles said with finality, "you're relieved of your duties as CTO, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building once you've provided Sarah with all passwords and access credentials needed for continued system recovery." And the termination was delivered with corporate efficiency, though the family implications would undoubtedly create complications that extended beyond immediate business needs. Brad's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and desperate appeal as he realized his executive career was ending in spectacular failure that would define his professional reputation permanently. "You can't fire me over one technical problem," he protested, his voice rising with panic. "I'm family, Uncle Charles. This situation is recoverable with proper support and resources. This situation is recoverable despite your leadership, not because of it," Charles replied coldly. "Your decision-making has demonstrated that family relationship doesn't qualify someone for positions that require technical competence and sound judgment." As security arrived to escort Brad from the building, the same security that had once jumped to fulfill his commands now treating him as a terminated employee requiring supervised exit, I reflected on the rapid reversal of fortune that had transformed the server room power dynamics overnight. The nephew who had bragged about being in charge now was leaving in disgrace, while the systems administrator he had dismissed as overcautious was being asked to assume technical leadership responsibilities that would determine the company's survival prospects. System restoration was completed at 3 p.m. on Friday, nearly 18 hours after Brad's catastrophic upgrade had crippled Technova's entire client network. The recovery process had required rebuilding corrupted databases, manually verifying thousands of financial transactions, and implementing emergency patches that addressed the compatibility issues I had warned about but been ordered to ignore. Charles remained in the server room throughout the final hours of restoration, observing the technical precision required to repair the damage his nephew's recklessness had caused. When the last client system came back online and green status lights finally replaced the red warnings that had dominated our monitoring displays, his relief was palpable, but tempered by awareness of the reputational and financial costs that would persist long after technical functionality was restored. "Client retention report," Maria Santos announced, as she entered with a tablet displaying preliminary damage assessment from her customer service team. 14 companies have formally terminated their contracts, representing approximately $2.8 million in annual revenue. Another 23 are demanding service guarantees and penalty clauses that would significantly impact our profit margins. The numbers confirmed what we had feared, that a single night of system failure could destroy client relationships built over years of reliable service. Financial software was a trust-based business where companies literally bet their operations on their vendors' technological competence. Brad's upgrade disaster had shattered that trust in ways that would take months or years to rebuild. Legal exposure, Charles asked Jennifer Walsh, who had been fielding increasingly aggressive demands from client attorneys seeking compensation for losses caused by our service interruption. Conservative estimate of $15 million in potential damages, she replied grimly. Several clients are claiming the outage prevented them from meeting regulatory filing deadlines that could trigger substantial penalties from federal agencies. This expansion of liability beyond direct financial losses to encompass regulatory consequences that our clients might face represented the kind of cascading damage that could force Teknova into bankruptcy, despite the successful technical restoration. Brad's moment of executive hubris had created legal and financial consequences that threatened to dwarf any performance improvements his upgrade might have eventually achieved. "Sarah," Charles said, using my first name for the first time in our 8-year professional relationship, "I'm promoting you to Chief Technology Officer, effective immediately. Your first responsibility is developing a comprehensive plan for rebuilding client confidence and preventing any similar failures in the future." The promotion represented not just personal vindication, but recognition that technical competence would now take precedence over family connections in Teknova's leadership structure. Charles had learned through painful experience that executive positions required expertise that couldn't be inherited or appointed through nepotism. "I accept," I replied, with the understanding that technical decision-making authority cannot be overridden by non-technical executives, regardless of timeline pressures or strategic preferences. This condition, establishing clear boundaries between business authority and technical judgment, addressed the fundamental problem that had enabled Brad's disaster through Charles's willingness to prioritize family advancement over operational prudence. "Agreed," Charles nodded, his expression reflecting hard-won wisdom about the necessity of respecting expertise rather than simply commanding compliance. "Technical operations will report directly to you with full authority to implement safety measures and maintenance procedures according to industry standards." As news of my promotion spread through Teknova's offices, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Engineers and administrators who had watched Brad's appointment with resigned cynicism now expressed genuine enthusiasm about technical leadership being placed in qualified hands. "The development team wants to know if we can finally implement the security upgrades that were postponed to accommodate Brad's pet projects," reported Tom Chen, our senior developer, whose expertise had been consistently ignored during Brad's tenure in favor of flashy but poorly planned initiatives. "Schedule them immediately," I replied, recognizing that employee morale and operational stability would be rebuilt through competent decision-making that prioritized technical excellence over executive ego. "We're returning to evidence-based technology management rather than management by wishful thinking." The crisis that had nearly destroyed Teknova would ultimately strengthen the company through forced recognition that technical competence couldn't be faked, that executive authority required expertise to be effective, and that family connections were worthless when facing the unforgiving reality of complex technological systems. Brad's bragging about being in charge now had preceded his complete humiliation by exactly the duration it had taken for his incompetence to create consequences that no amount of executive privilege could minimize or escape. 6 months after the server crash that had ended Brad's brief and disastrous tenure as CTO, Teknova faced its most critical test, a comprehensive security audit by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, triggered by client complaints about the data integrity failures caused by his reckless upgrade decision. The audit team had arrived Monday morning, armed with forensic analysis tools and authority to examine every aspect of our technical operations and security protocols. I stood in the main conference room, presenting the comprehensive reforms we had implemented since the crisis, while the FINRA examiners evaluated whether Teknova could be trusted with sensitive financial data following such a spectacular failure of technical leadership. The next 2 hours would determine whether we retained our regulatory authorization to serve financial services clients, authorization that represented the foundation of our entire business model. "The load balancing incident you've described," observed Dr. Patricia Reynolds, The lead examiner, whose cybersecurity background made her particularly focused on technical decision-making processes, resulted from implementing untested system modifications during peak operating hours, despite warnings from qualified technical staff. Her summary reduced Brad's elaborate executive justifications to their essential elements: reckless endangerment of client data through ignorance of basic technical safety procedures. The clinical precision of her assessment made the decision-making failures seem even more egregious than they had appeared during the emotional crisis of system recovery. "Correct," I confirmed. The former CTO overrode established maintenance protocols because he wanted to present performance improvements at a board meeting, despite being explicitly warned that the upgrade could cause exactly the type of system failures that ultimately occurred. And the current technical leadership structure has been restructured to prevent similar failures? Dr. Reynolds continued, consulting her notes about the organizational changes we had implemented following the crisis. Yes, technical decision-making authority is now clearly separated from business operations, with mandatory override procedures that prevent non-technical executives from forcing implementation of potentially dangerous system modifications, I explained, outlining the governance framework that would ensure competence, rather than hierarchy, determined critical technical decisions. The audit continued through detailed examination of our recovery procedures, security protocols, and the client compensation programs we had established to address losses caused by the server crash. Most importantly, the examiners evaluated whether our reformed leadership structure could prevent recurrence of the kind of executive overreach that had created the original crisis. "Mr. Hutchinson," Dr. Reynolds addressed Charles directly, "the evidence suggests your company suffered catastrophic failure due to appointment of technically unqualified leadership, motivated by family relationships rather than professional competence. What assurances can you provide that similar nepotistic decisions won't threaten client data security in the future?" The question cut to the heart of Technova's cultural transformation: whether Charles had learned from his nephew's disaster sufficiently to prioritize technical expertise over family loyalty when making critical appointments. "Technical leadership positions will be filled based exclusively on demonstrated competence and industry experience," Charles replied with conviction that reflected genuine recognition of his previous error. "Family relationships will not be considered as qualifications for roles requiring specialized expertise." This formal repudiation of nepotistic hiring, delivered to federal regulators rather than merely stated in internal policy, represented Charles's acknowledgement that his nephew's appointment had been a fundamental mistake that had nearly destroyed the company through predictable consequences of placing unqualified leadership in critical positions. As the audit concluded with preliminary approval for continued operations under enhanced oversight, I reflected on the complete reversal of circumstances that had occurred since Brad's confident assertion of authority had preceded his spectacular demonstration of incompetence. The nephew who had bragged about being in charge had learned that authority without capability was merely opportunity for more visible failure. The server crash had exposed the fundamental difference between inherited position and earned leadership, between family privilege and professional competence, between the appearance of authority and its effective application. Brad's disaster had ultimately strengthened Technova by forcing recognition of these distinctions and ensuring they would guide future decision-making. 2 years after Brad Hutchinson's catastrophic server upgrade had nearly destroyed Technova Industries, I stood before the International Conference on Financial Technology Security, delivering the keynote address on preventing technology failures through competence-based leadership. The auditorium was packed with CTOs, security experts, and regulatory officials who had followed Technova's transformation from near collapse to industry leadership in technical excellence and operational reliability. "The most dangerous threats to financial technology systems," I explained to the attentive audience, "don't come from external hackers or sophisticated cyber attacks. They come from internal decision-makers who possess authority without expertise, who prioritize appearance over substance, and who view technical safeguards as obstacles to their ambitions rather than essential protections for the systems they've been entrusted to manage." This assessment had emerged from painful experience, watching Brad's combination of executive privilege and technical ignorance create the exact catastrophic failures that proper oversight was designed to prevent. His appointment to CTO had been corporate nepotism at its most dangerous, placing complex technological systems under the control of someone whose qualifications were measured by family connections rather than professional competence. Technova's recovery had been remarkable by any standard. Not only had we rebuilt client relationships damaged by the server crash, but we had emerged as the industry leader in technical reliability and security protocols. The crisis had forced us to implement best practices that competitors were now struggling to match, creating competitive advantages that more than compensated for the immediate costs of Brad's disaster. The nephew who bragged about being in charge learned that authority is only as valuable as the competence to exercise it effectively, I continued, sharing the story that had become legendary within technology circles. His confidence in overriding technical expertise lasted exactly as long as it took for reality to demonstrate the consequences of ignorance combined with power. The audience's response suggested this cautionary tale resonated with professionals who had witnessed similar failures at other companies where family connections or political maneuvering had elevated unqualified individuals to critical technical positions. Brad's spectacular downfall had become a case study in business schools and professional development programs focused on the importance of merit-based leadership in technology organizations. My own career had been transformed by the crisis in ways that extended far beyond the CTO promotion Charles had offered in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. Recognition for managing the recovery had led to consulting opportunities, speaking engagements, and eventually the establishment of my own cybersecurity firm, specializing in preventing the kind of technical disasters that resulted from poor executive decision-making. The most complete vindication, I concluded to the conference audience, wasn't watching incompetent leadership fail spectacularly, though that failure was predictable and ultimately necessary for organizational survival. The real satisfaction was seeing competence-based decision-making replace nepotistic appointment, technical expertise valued over family connections, and operational excellence prioritized over executive ego. This transformation, from systems administrator whose warnings were dismissed to industry leader whose insights influenced policy across multiple countries, represented the natural consequence of persistent commitment to technical excellence despite pressure to subordinate professional judgment to political convenience. In the 2 years since Brad's bragging about authority had preceded his complete humiliation, he had disappeared from the technology industry entirely, his name permanently associated with one of the most preventable and devastating system failures in financial technology history. The executive privilege that had protected him from consequences throughout his brief career had proven worthless when confronted with the unforgiving reality of complex technological systems that operated according to engineering principles rather than corporate hierarchy. Charles Hutchinson had eventually sold Technova to a larger firm, using the proceeds to establish a technology foundation focused on merit-based professional development and education. His recognition that family loyalty had nearly destroyed his life's work had prompted a fundamental re-evaluation of values and priorities that extended beyond immediate business concerns to encompass broader questions about how capability and authority should be aligned in technology organizations. The server that had crashed under Brad's watch had been replaced with systems designed according to the comprehensive redundancy and safety protocols that his arrogance had prevented us from implementing earlier. Those systems now served not just as technical infrastructure, but as monuments to the principle that expertise must guide authority, that competence cannot be inherited or appointed, and that the most dangerous phrase in any technology organization is, "I'm in charge now," when spoken by someone whose qualifications don't extend beyond family connections or political positioning. The crash had indeed changed everything, destroying comfortable assumptions about leadership while creating foundation for authentic technical excellence that served clients, employees, and the broader technology industry through example and innovation rather than merely inherited privilege and executive presumption. If you enjoyed this story of technical hubris, corporate nepotism, and the triumph of competence over connections, please subscribe to my channel for more tales that explore the dangerous intersection of power and incompetence in the modern workplace. In my next video, we'll discover another riveting narrative where those who abuse their authority face the harsh judgment of reality itself. Until then, remember that in the world of technology, the most expensive words are often "trust me" and the most valuable are, let me show you the technical specifications.